Hello everybody and welcome to this next online lesson. We're going to look at Detente today, the end of Cold War One. So it's in the 1970s, pretty much for the whole decade. So let's get started. A really important topic this when we start looking at how the Cold War got better. Everything in this course is generally nearly the end of the world or something bad happens and that leads to something else. Well, in this story, things are going to get very good. Just a shame that they didn't last longer than 9 years. Okay, so let's get started. So we're going to try and look at today why the USA and the USSR began this policy of détente. Why was it the right time in history, in the whole Cold War saga, for them to try and work together a little bit more? We're going to have a look at some of the agreements that they made, and we're going to try and understand why it failed in the end, or why it was abandoned. Okay, so before we get started, the definition for détente is a period of peace, reduced tensions between two groups that were previously at war or hostile to each other. So basically, it's French for relations got better, improved, things like that. Okay, so this could be a good thing to be thinking about our tension words as we go through this lesson. With instead of things worsening or deteriorating, things are going to improve significantly. Okay, so it's in three parts, détente. So thinking about this as a narrative, we have the first part, which you'll see in a sec, will be SALT 1, the SALT 1 talks. Then there'll be Helsinki, will be part 2, the middle. And the end of this will be SALT 2, or the failure of SALT 2 rather, and some growing tension between both sides. Okay, so think of it as we go through the lesson as a narrative. We'll also talk as well at the end of this online lesson how it might look in question 3, an importance question. Okay, so the search for peace. Here's some context and some backstory to why détente all of a sudden seems like a good idea. We've just realised, haven't we, with the Cuban Missile Crisis a couple of years ago, that we got to the brink of nuclear holocaust, the end of the world, the end of humanity. The arms race during the 50s has led to the potential to destroy the world many times over, especially with this mutually assured destruction idea. So with that in mind, and Cuba, it was clear, wasn't it, as a consequence of Cuba, that both sides were going to try and work together a little bit with the hotline and the test bans. So just a little reminder of some of those things they agreed, probably as a result of Cuba, but also in this sort of climate of more cooperation. In 1967, the Outer Space Treaty, where both countries had agreed no nuclear weapons would be placed in space. All right. So if you're watching this as a Year 11 revising for your exams, then just remember the idea of Reagan with his Star Wars goes against this treaty, just for some extra revision during this topic. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was agreed that neither superpower would supply weapons to any of their allies. All right, so thus essentially ending MAD. So that's where we are as we approach the end of the 1960s. There's a little bit more to it, but we'll talk about in a minute about what was going on in both countries in the 60s. But there's definitely a desire, I would say, from both sides to try and improve relations and end this sort of horrible Cold War where nobody knows if it's going to end badly or what's going to happen the next day. Also, keeping in mind that Brezhnev is the leader of the Soviet Union, Nixon, as the start of the 70s, is the president of America. Brezhnev has just in 1968 put down the Prague Spring, remember, so he's feeling pretty confident with himself. He's sort of put down any possible rebellion within his own Warsaw Pact, within the satellite states. And once again, with the Brezhnev Doctrine, has kind of ensured that there'll be no outside interference either. So Brezhnev's come into this decade feeling pretty confident that the Soviet Union has never been more secure within its own borders, and America as well is ready for some peace, probably, as it's going to be dealing with Vietnam, etc., which we'll talk about in a sec. So hopefully that makes sense as to why we go from this Cold War, this Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Crisis, all of these things that have been happening in the last few years, to a period of peace where everyone's going to get on. It just kind of seems mad, but you'll see why now, why that happened. All right, so this is a good way as well to save some money as well. Détente means that they won't have to spend so much money on weapons. That's quite obvious, but there's also some issues within each country as well. So let's get cracking on and see what that might look like. All right, so in America, we've got clearly the 1960s, the civil rights movement at its peak. We've got all the protests, we've got all the violence. You'll have learned about that in Key Stage 3. But the photographs on the screen, they explain exactly, they show you what was going on. down in Alabama, where they set Alsatians onto the African Americans. And you can also see at the top here that Martin Luther King is in his coffin. So the 1960s generally for Americans was horrendous. It was full of protest, it was full of violence. And everyone was just getting a little bit fed up of that. But also, Nixon is determined to bring America out of Vietnam. This Vietnam War has been going on for a while now. It's expensive. It's costing the US billions of dollars. 60,000 soldiers have died. So Detente might just bring an end to this as well. As I say, the people are just totally fed up with all of the aggression and violence in America. Martin Luther King was assassinated, so was JFK, remember? This is just the time for a bit of a reset, I think. The 70s was inevitable, all right, just because of how bad the 60s were. So that's what's going on in the US. And also on television, as a lot of people are getting televisions now in the 1960s, we're starting to see some really horrific images that you can see appearing on the screen now. Some of the most famous images ever to come out of the Vietnam War. So people were seeing these things on their televisions and they were in shock in America. They were angry, they were sad, they were just fed up, and of course their own relatives being killed as well. So that really led to even more protest about the Vietnam War. So Nixon really did not stand a chance in his short presidency to try and even carry on the Cold War. So just pause this video before we move on to the next bit and just write a little summary in your Google Doc or in your book or wherever you're writing your notes for this lesson. Why do you think, summarize what we've talked about so far, why this was a good time for Detente for the United States. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we will carry on. Okay, so let's have a look at like what was going on in the Soviet Union as well. So the Soviet Union economy, as we know, is rubbish. It's not growing up. It's communist, isn't it? We know it's poor. We've said, haven't we, that West is best and everything looks better in the West. So this might be good for them to sort of try and help their economy a little bit by spending less on weapons on the arms race. They also feel that they've got plenty already. They've been doing this arms race for years now, as have the USA. So they probably feel like they've got quite enough now. They don't need to spend any more. The living standards in communist countries are going down. Highlighted again by the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia just a few years ago. Obviously, life in communist countries is really rubbish. So maybe the Czech uprising, whilst it was an easy sort of success for Brezhnev to put it down, maybe it has triggered a little bit within the Soviet government that the people need to have a slightly better standard of living to make communism even work. All right, so perhaps that's what's going on there. So we've got these two sides looking for a sort of way out, if you like. But remember, it's all about keeping face as well. So just these three boxes on the screen now, this little summary really. Hopefully you just wrote that down when you were summarizing the US. But just to really summarize, the Soviet Union are looking for a way out of this Cold War because of their own living standards. The economy is rubbish and they just keep spending loads of money on weapons. The social problems in the US. So Detente is this sort of magic bullet, if you like, this way out, so both sides can stop the fighting and the tensions without either of them looking particularly bad. So that's where we are with that. And then also there's a word that's probably brand new to some of you, is Ostpolitik. So Willy Brandt had been elected as the new Chancellor of West Germany, and his policy of this Ostpolitik, which is all basically just building better relations within East and West Germany, other European countries also wanted some of that too. Everyone, I feel like, as we get to the 70s, is just a bit fed up of the Cold War. It's been going on since the end of World War II, hasn't it? So all in all, everything seems to have just come together in time for the 1970s to lead us to this period of détente, all right, of peace. So that's the first bit of this topic, really. It's a bit of backstory. Perhaps you could get that into, if it was a narrative, maybe this could all be the first bit, the reasons why, and then you could go into SALT 1, or maybe just a brief summary in a narrative question, and then begin on SALT 1, which is the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. So that just means to limit the amount of weapons that both sides have got. So this is in May 1972. It's going to impose limits on both sides and the nuclear capability of both sides. So this is going to be an agreement. Okay, so the first thing that they're going to agree in the SALT 1 treaty, which is limited in time, this is going to be short term, and hopefully one day it will become permanent. But for a shorter period of time, they're going to agree to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Both sides are basically only allowed 200 anti-ballistic missiles, and they're used to basically shoot down normal missiles, ICBMs, out of the sky. So it's a defensive measure, but also it has the potential, doesn't it, to fire missiles. So both sides have agreed to have just 200 anti-ballistic missiles. They've also agreed as well that the USA can have 1,054 ICBMs, and the Soviet Union are allowed 1,618. The only reason the Soviet Union are allowed a few more is because America's got a much greater air force and air power. So that's going to be for a 5-year freeze, but that is also quite a nice agreement, a big agreement. And ultimately what we're looking at here is both sides are there negotiating, talking to each other. This is a large step away from the 1950s tensions, isn't it? Even the 1960s, the early 1960s. So this is incredible to be thinking about this as even happening when you think that 10 years ago was the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they've also agreed on a new conduct to avoid nuclear war. They're going to ban nuclear warheads on the seabed, and they're going to talk about their problems before going for weapons. Now, that's called diplomacy, but this is an agreement that instead of going straight for the weapons in a crisis, we're going to try and talk to each other first. Again, maybe that has got some links back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they got really close to that brinkmanship. And then finally, we think about SALT 1 is that both sides can only have 740 SLBM, so submarine launched missiles. The reason why that's a really important agreement is because the submarines can obviously go anywhere in the world underwater and can attack from anywhere. Clearly entering other people's seas is a tension. We saw that with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but that's a really good agreement as well. So overall, Detente has created this environment where both sides are able to cooperate. Hopefully you can see that there's a large potential there that SALT 1 would have made many people happy. In fact, everybody, when they saw the agreements of this in the newspaper or on television or on the radio, or they heard it on the radio, everyone might have just breathed a massive sigh of relief, especially those who thought that the Prague Spring might have triggered some Cold War tensions again, considering how good the late 60s was going after Cuba. So SALT 1, and this would be paragraph 1 in your narrative question, the beginning of Detente. This is the first agreement, and of course this is going to lead to more positive talks going forward, and eventually we're going to have SALT 2, which is going to make these agreements permanent. But for now, they're just temporary, but it's definitely a positive. All right, but it's important to just take a little step back before we move on. There are some weaknesses of SALT 1 as well. So in reality, if there was going to be a nuclear war, if something kicked off again, which is probably likely, you know what it's like since 1945, one thing's happened that's led to another. This is just a bit of paper. It's probably not going to stop each other using nuclear weapons, is it? Although it's nice that it's done and it's happening, in reality, it probably wouldn't stop a war. And both countries, despite these limitations, still have enough weapons to destroy the world many times over. All right. So with that said, there are some weaknesses, and obviously we could put that into our question that everything was mainly good. There was plenty good, but one slight negative of Detente or of SALT 1 is, as we've said there, it's not really going to stop the end of the world. But both sides are together, they're talking, they're visiting each other. It's just really positive, okay? But there is one huge problem with SALT 1, is they haven't stopped the MIRVs. The MIRVs are these new sort of super weapons, if you like, nuclear warheads that, as you can see from the pictures on the screen, you fire one and essentially they split off into lots and lots and lots of different missiles. So you can see the kind of damage that the MIRVs can do, and each one of the lines that you're looking at has about 25 times the power of Hiroshima, which is obviously, we know how bad that was after the US dropped the bombs on Japan. So the MIRVs not being touched or restricted in any way sort of kind of makes the whole thing a mockery, doesn't it? Makes SALT 1 a mockery. But maybe at SALT 2, they might introduce some limits on MIRVs as well. Let's hope, okay? So far, hopefully we can see that the 1970s has gone really well. Agreements, positive agreements, steps towards essentially ending the world of all nuclear weapons. maybe this is a great decade. Maybe this is going to be the end of the Cold War. And obviously, we know we've said our title in today's lesson is the end of Cold War One. But the fact that there's a number one there tells us, doesn't it, that there's going to be Cold War Two. Those of you that are revising using this video, you'll know that the second Cold War comes at the end of SALT, at the end of Detente with Reagan's election. Those of you watching this for the first time during lessons, that's what's going to be coming later. All right, so great start to Detente, SALT 1. We can see from these photographs the world was happy, lots of politicians doing really good stuff. However, US historian says, Stephen Ambrose in 1985, SALT 1 in 1972 froze the ICBM deployment, but not the MIRVs, which was as meaningful as freezing the cavalry, so that's the horseback riders, of European countries in 1938, but not the tanks. All right, so you've stopped the horses riding towards you, but you didn't stop the tanks. So Ambrose is definitely attacking or criticizing SALT 1. And then straight away, Nixon was adding 3 MIRVs a day, despite the agreements at SALT 1. So there's always that little element of tension, and historian Ambrose here is definitely highlighting the weaknesses of SALT 1. But just to try and keep this positive, we are in a decade of peace, or seeking peace, remember. So maybe these things will be dealt with later in the decade. All right, so some consequences, only like really a few obvious ones. Nixon and Brezhnev are visiting each other, relations are good. That's a consequence of SALT 1. And obviously those 4 details that we've just talked about, the limits, the numbers, the diplomacy, they would be your consequences of SALT 1. Quite a nice question one, really, if that was there. And this is a really great photograph. When you think about the state of play over the last 2 decades, to see a Soviet leader at the White House is crazy, isn't it? And of course, then SALT 2 talks are going to improve things even further, but those talks start straight away almost in 1974 after this visit of the Soviet leader to Washington. So overall, I think we can definitely summarize that the first bit of Detente has gone really well. Remember, if you're watching this for the first time as a catch-up, make sure that your notes are clear of this as part 1, the beginning of Detente. Make sure you've got some good notes written down about what the consequences were and what the significance of the beginning bit were, SALT 1, on international relations or development of the Cold War as well. Okay, so then we get to the middle of our decade and the middle of our story. If the question was a narrative, the Helsinki Summit, or they might also be called the Helsinki Accords. So right in the middle of the decade, in 1975, 35 nations from NATO and Warsaw Pact countries, which that alone, let's just take a step back to think about that. NATO and Warsaw Pact countries are going to meet together in Helsinki in the spirit of this cooperation, the positivity out of SALT 1. And we're going to have these 3 agreements that are going to be done at Helsinki. They're going to become known as baskets. So we've got 1 basket on European borders, so an agreement on European borders, international cooperation, and human rights. So basket 1, 2, and 3. This is where we're going to be in 1975. This is something that nobody in their right mind during the first Cold War from 1945 up until the 1970s would have considered a possibility that both sides are going to meet together and agree to all of these things, especially after, obviously, the Cuba crisis more recently. All right, so let's get into this then, but keeping in mind this is going to stabilize and secure the positivity in Europe, greater cooperation between the 2 superpowers, and of course then their allies. We're going to see trade, and we're going to see togetherness in fighting international terrorism. It's like a perfect world. It's like a utopia, which is crazy when you think about where we've come from. So now let's break down the Helsinki summits a little bit. Remember, if it's a narrative, this is going to be your paragraph 2, but also now make your notes and consider this, especially if you're revising just before your exams in year 11, you're watching this video, that you're going to need to think about this as question 1. It could be 1 consequence of the Helsinki summits, or it could be how important was the Helsinki summits for international relations. So always be thinking about, in this Cold War course, what could this topic look like in the exam, and be thinking about the language that we use as we talk about that. So improving, worsening, deteriorating, those kinds of things. Okay. And then remember connectives, this led to, as a result, because of this, etc. All those kinds of things. So the first basket that we would be agreeing on, all of these countries, 35 countries, is European borders. Okay, so the first thing to think about is that they're going to agree, all these countries, that no country would interfere in the internal affairs of another country. All right. That's a little bit rich, isn't it, coming from 1968 and the Brezhnev Doctrine. And if you have a little look at that quote down there on the left-hand side of the screen, coming from Brezhnev again, it's hilarious. No one should try to dictate to other peoples how they should manage their internal affairs. He must be saying that with some sort of smirk or smile, remembering that the Brezhnev Doctrine has essentially taken away every single country in the Warsaw Pact rights away, and he controls them. So he's probably saying that, but then maybe, given the benefit of the doubt, he might actually remove the Brezhnev Doctrine after Helsinki because it might go against this. So a second agreement of the European borders was that all countries' borders were accepted, all right, for the first time. And remember the Berlin Second Crisis? One of the most important things that Khrushchev wanted was that East Germany would be acknowledged and legitimized as a real country. And finally, in 1975, East and West Germany have accepted each other's existence for the first time. So that in itself is huge. And that was ultimately really the reason for the Berlin Wall, I suppose. After Khrushchev's ultimatum, he was just trying to make a point, wasn't he, to make America accept East Germany. So there we go. That's a huge win for the Soviet Union. And then thirdly, that all disputes were to be settled peacefully, not by the use of threats or force, and the United Nations would step in if necessary. So this is agreed. Excellent. This is great for everybody. So you probably would include, I guess, one, two, or maybe even all three of those little orange boxes into a bit of your Helsinki paragraph. But remember, you've got to try and get 3 baskets in here. So maybe one example from all 3 would be enough. You haven't got a long time to write this question, but you've got plenty that you could pick. Just remember European borders, and that will hopefully trigger 1 or 2 of these little examples. Okay, so then we get onto basket 2, which is about international cooperation. So all of these countries working together in various ways. So firstly, they're all going to cooperate using through their industries, projects, working together, sharing materials, sharing resources, things in the East being shared with things in the West. Just crazy, actually mind-blowing. Just talking to you, doing this video, thinking about how the Cold War course has developed so far. This is crazy. Fantastic, brilliant. I would imagine people living in the 70s would have been very, very relieved. Another agreement about basket 2 would be trade. Get crazy, all right? The United States are going to buy oil from the Soviet Union, whilst the Soviet Union is going to buy wheat from the USA. Think about the sugar in Cuba. Think about everything that's happened, and now we're going to be buying supplies off each other, boosting each other's economies. Just brilliant. This is why Helsinki and this decade of Detente is so incredible. And it's so crazy, you should hopefully remember it just because it's mad. So scientific cooperation as well is going to boost everybody. So we're going to share information from medical research, space research. We're going to share everything and work together. So basket 2, again, is absolutely mind-blowing, but fairly straightforward, hopefully. Just remember international cooperation, and hopefully that will trigger a few little agreements or memories on the things they agreed to do. They're also going to cooperate on education. They're going to share student exchanges, learning languages, working together. Okay, I think it's brilliant. I think the whole thing is brilliant. Personally, for me, obviously, as a teacher, that was one of the best things that come out of Helsinki, of this working together, is that young people are going to be able to get an experience of different cultures and languages all over Europe. Okay. So the image that you can see here is one of the most famous images, really, of the 1970s. This is a photograph of Russian cosmonauts and US astronauts going to space together, working together. All right. It's called the Apollo-Soyuz mission. And this may be a really great example in your paragraph that you can just bring up as a specific example of working together, that they were in space. And ultimately, this is all very lovely on the telly, as everyone's getting televisions. Remember, there was a handshake in space. Just the image of that It's just crazy. So the 60s have been dominated by this space race. Remember, 1969, the United States got to the moon first. So a little bit of bragging rights for that, I suppose. But here we are now in the 70s, some cooperation in space, working together. The ISS will soon be a thing. So, it's just really, really good. And you're seeing these things in the newspapers, on television, on the radio, just mind blowing. All right. So let's do the final basket of Helsinki. Human rights. So we're going to agree on human rights. Now, before we do, maybe pause the video and just make a little list in your book or on your Google Doc about the kinds of things that you might expect to see now in the human rights basket, especially when you think about life in communist countries. How has it been since World War II? And let's just see what the Soviets might agree to. All right. Firstly, freedom of movement. So every country's agreed that within Europe, anywhere really, people have freedom of movement. They also have freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of information. It's crazy when you think that Brezhnev just put down the Prague Spring, and this is kind of what Dubček was trying to do, wasn't it? Give the Czech people all of these freedoms whilst never wanting to leave the Warsaw Pact. Unlike Nagy during the Hungarian uprising in 1956, he too tried to give people some of these freedoms, but he wanted to leave the Warsaw Pact. So Brezhnev's response in Czechoslovakia, as I think we've established in class, was very extreme, very harsh. But here we are, the Soviet Union have agreed to basket 3 as well, giving everybody, including those Warsaw Pact countries, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of information. Just fabulous. All right, so this little summary diagram here, just a quickie, you can just pause the video if you want to have a little bit more of a detailed look, but this is the evidence that the tensions around the world are starting to ease in the 70s. There's a Sino-Soviet split. That basically means China and Russia, their relationships are breaking down a little bit. The Vietnam War is coming to an end, hands are shaking space. As everything we've talked about so far, as a little summary of why the 1970s is so good. Okay, so before we do move on, maybe just pause the video and again, like part 1 or the beginning of this story, Salt 1, make sure you've got your notes in order. Make sure you fully understand the middle bit of the story, Helsinki. Make sure you've got some good examples for the 3 baskets, but also the bigger picture of things, considering if it's question 3, how important was Helsinki for international relations, then there's plenty you can say, full of positives. If it's development of the Cold War, plenty to say how it improved tensions and things like that. When you're ready for that and you're happy to move on to part 3, just unpause the video and press play. Okay, so let's have a little think then before we do look at the end of this story. Who really won at Helsinki? Did anyone win? Did both sides win? Did one get more than the other? Maybe have a little think. Answer this yourself in your Google Doc or in your book. Who do you think overall, when you consider everything that's happened from Salt 1 and the 3 baskets, who has come out on top? And then we'll have a little talk now and we'll have a little think to see if you agree or change your mind after the next couple of minutes. So firstly, the USA, they wanted an extension of human rights into the Soviet-controlled areas. This is going to undermine communist authority and weaken the power or influence of the Soviet Union. So that's a big win, isn't it, for America? They've literally got human rights into the Warsaw Pact. That's incredible. So America must be thrilled to bits with this. Although there's a little bit of concern about how do you actually make the Soviet Union follow basket 3? How do you make them allow this freedom of movement, especially after the Brezhnev Doctrine? All right, so I would say the USA would be very happy with basket 3. The Soviet Union, they now have guaranteed and recognized borders. All of the satellite states, they've all been recognized officially, especially East Germany. So the Soviet Union are going to be thrilled to bits with this. The Soviet economy is just getting boosted no end by the US buying their oil. So I reckon they're going to be happy with baskets 1 and 2. Now, feel free to disagree with me on this one. I'm just giving you some examples of where I think both sides could weigh up who wins this Helsinki. The USA are struggling a little bit at home. The Hawks, remember the Hawks and the Doves? The Hawks are very unhappy. They're basically saying that America's given far too much to the Soviet Union. They've legitimized the empire in Eastern Europe, essentially, is what a lot of Americans are saying, or politicians and people, citizens. They're saying America's just rolled over and said, okay, you can have this huge empire. which sort of goes against the Truman Doctrine, doesn't it, and the idea of containment. So that's one sort of train of thought in the US. So they would be unhappy with basket one, the borders, especially East Germany, a lot of them. And then in the Soviet Union, to flip this around, the Soviets are concerned that there would be organizations being set up to monitor what's happening in these countries, these policies, because there's freedom of information, remember, from basket three. They could be really worried about that because no one can stop them, allegedly, thanks to this idea of international cooperation. So they're a bit worried that basket three is going to weaken their grip, especially keeping in mind the Brezhnev doctrine. So with all that said, having just said that to you and you're watching this and you can see on the screen, maybe write a little paragraph in your notes about who you think really won at Helsinki. Was it a completely successful event for both sides? Are there any tensions still that you could maybe write about? Or just overall, would you think this was a very positive experience? Okay, so that's Helsinki in a bit of a nutshell. So before we move on, I think it'd be interesting just to pause the video and read this source. I've put two pictures of Brezhnev, a bit sort of smirky. Partly it's to maybe frame your thought as you read the source, but just read the source generally. It comes across a little bit like the Soviet Union is just nodding in all the right places, especially regarding basket three, without really any real seriousness about enforcing it. See what you think. That's the joy of history, isn't it? That we read things and we interpret things ourselves. You have a little read of source E. See what you think they mean, what they're talking about. Were they serious? Were they really serious about moving forward? And then when you're ready, unpause the video and we'll move on and we'll look at a second source from the US side. Okay. Right. So if we look at source D, then this was said by President Ford, who didn't have a very long term in power. History will judge this conference not by what we say here today, but by what we do tomorrow. Not by the promises we make, but by the promises we keep. So I don't know. Do you think that President Ford is confident in Helsinki? Does that sound like the kind of statement a confident person would say about the future? Or does he? Do you interpret that as he's saying, okay, we've done good here, but now actions speak louder than words kind of thing? I don't know. So with both those sources that we've just had a little think about, which side do you think was probably most willing to make sure all of these agreements worked out and went on for the long term? You can obviously think that neither side really. It's all about your interpretation of these things. I just thought that would be quite an interesting little aside to do as you're working your way through this lesson. All right, so let's get ourselves to the end then. SALT II talks in 1979. All right, so still about limiting arms. We think that SALT II is going to make everything permanent from SALT I, but just some backstory as we get to 1979. All the glory of this lesson so far, all the good stuff, there's a real tension. We'll go through some of those reasons now, but just keep in mind that as they come to the table to negotiate SALT II, there's some real tensions, all right? So firstly, there's a lot of distrust in America of Brezhnev and the Soviet Union. Like we've just sort of said there, the hawks, some of the hawks in America, the politicians and the civilians, they believe that Russia got a good deal, far too good a deal out of Helsinki, much better than the US did. And the Soviet Union are starting to allegedly, I suppose, interfere in supporting communist groups around the world, which remember has gone against SALT I and Helsinki, where we're not going to interfere in other countries' borders. So that's upsetting America a little bit, or certainly some of the Americans. As well as that, the USA politicians, they believe that if we give anything more to the Soviet Union, like we did at SALT I, then we're just going to look so weak that the Soviet Union will be laughing at us. So a lot of people in America are putting pressure on the president in these next negotiations just to not give any more to the Soviet Union. They've had enough. You know, we're buying their oil. We've reduced our weapons. You know, we've let them have more ICBMs. We seem to have, in the eyes of many Americans, given them too much. And there's just no appetite to give them any more at SALT II. Furthermore, and this is huge, this is massive now, Islamic militants had captured an American embassy in Tehran with hostages in there, about 444 days. And because of this is embarrassing, isn't it? Don't forget the USA is a huge country. They're trying to show their power. We know they're a global superpower. But this is a bit embarrassing, isn't it? That like their embassy in Tehran has been taken over essentially for such a long time. Every day on the news, people will be waiting to see, is it over? Has America, fought back and flicked this little nuisance away? But they didn't. So people were starting to think that America was looking really weak, cowardly, that Detente has essentially taken the teeth of this once great nation away. So there's a lot of talk in America about making America great again as we get to the end of the 1970s, of showing the world what a global powerhouse looks like, not one that's going to be bullied by Islamic militants and embarrassed that this thing went on for 444 days. So that is quite an obvious reason as to why maybe attitudes are starting to just change a little bit from this beautiful cooperation world to something a bit more serious. Furthermore, then once again, the Soviet Union have stationed 2,000 plus troops in Cuba. Again, going against Helsinki agreements about interfering in other countries, but also taking us back to 1960s with troops in Cuba, 90 miles away from America. Part of me is just baffled that the 70s has gone so well that we get to 1979 and the Soviet Union do something stupid like this. I don't know. That kind of maybe proves a little bit when we did that source activity just a little while ago that the Soviet Union were probably never quite in this for the long haul. But maybe the Soviet Union are hearing some of the rhetoric coming from America and just naturally getting their defences in for that. And then in December of 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan. A full-on invasion, a proper invasion. Not sort of sending the tanks into Czechoslovakia to put them back in their place. This is a full-on invasion, which of course goes against Helsinki. It's using military instead of talking like was agreed at SALT 1. So as you can imagine, the big consequence of this is that the USA withdrew from the SALT 2 talks. It wasn't ratified. That means it was never signed in officially. And that is the official end of Detente. It's quite clear. There's no doubt here, I don't think, that the Soviet Union are to blame for this end, this really dramatic end to what was an incredible decade. But we're going to elect Ronald Reagan in the USA very shortly as well. And of course, if you're watching this as you're going, you'll see that that's no innocent either. But if you're watching this as year 11 revising for your exams, you'll know what's coming with Reagan and his threats and his aggression. So this is why this lesson is all about the end of Cold War One. But also now we're seeing at this bit of the lesson why it's going to be the start of Cold War Two. All right, so very briefly though, before we finish this lesson, there was an agreement before it was taken off the table that they were going to limit each other to MIRVs. So that was going to be a good thing despite all the tensions. It doesn't matter though. You can just say in your answer that there was a slight positive out of SALT 2. They were going to limit MIRVs, but as it was, it never happened due to the actions of the Soviet Union, and the American President Carter withdrew, went home, left the SALT 2 talk. So officially, as you'll see in the Afghanistan invasion lesson, America are the ones who left the SALT 2 talks, but I don't think anyone can really blame them, to be honest. All right, so thinking about this for your exam, having done this lesson now, why don't you stop the video and write the narrative that you can see on the screen? Obviously, remember, our narrative is beginning, middle, and end. In this case, they've given us the beginning and the middle. They would expect you to add the end. Paragraph 3 would be the end. I think it would be a lovely exam question if this does ever crop up, because there's plenty to say. One of those topics where you could leave out most of it and still get a really brilliant answer. But also to consider how it might be a question 3. How important was Detente for international relations? How important was SALT 1 for development of the Cold War? Any question that you can make up. We know what the questions are going to be like. This is why the Cold War paper is really nice in that sense. You could take any topic and you can manipulate that into any of the questions. And of course, question 1 could be give one consequence of Detente, one consequence of Helsinki, one consequence of SALT 1, SALT 2, anything at all like that. All right. So this is the topic that you probably do need to get your head around, because it could fit any of the 3 questions, but it's also so big that it could come up in all sorts of different examples. So get your head around it for sure. So as always, thank you so much for watching. Hopefully it was helpful, especially if you're revising as year 11. But if you're catching up because you missed the lesson, hopefully you've managed to get your head around a lot of this. All of our lessons, remember, are on stchistory.com. And if there's any other questions or anything's cropped up from this video, just give us a shout or ask your teacher. All right. Thank you very much, and we'll see you for the next video. Goodbye.